Well, I would start with really social work and clinical social work based, which has to do. We're also a value. We come from values, from solid values that I think make us different than other therapists and other analysts. That's our base, our social work base. So regarding dignity, and worth of the other person, I think we carry that within us. But the history, not so much for the young people now, because now the analytic institutes are reaching out on every corner to get them to come in. But in the old days, as part of the history, of course, we were absolutely marginalized and made to feel less than. And Clayton and others have talked about that. Rosemarie, others have talked about it. But I do think for clinical social work, I do think that our organization and other educational organizations have really helped us come of age, take a certain pride in who we are, our sense of competence and mastery and worth. And I think that this organization absolutely supports that whole idea of 4 clinical social workers, 5 clinical social workers. Not that we don't have other people come in and contribute, but we're the core, and we can do that ourselves. And that really does build a certain sense of competence and mastery. And I think this is one of the key parts of our organization, always has been. It's what drew me in. I had recently finished a long tenure as dean. I wasn't dying to take on any other kind of administrative position, but when Marsh asked me, what interested me was the group, the collegiality that everyone's talked about, the non-hierarchical sense, and the spirit of who we are and what we are, what we have to offer the world and our clients and patients.
Simone, if someone asks you, what do you call yourself? What do you call yourself now?
It depends on who asks me. Sometimes I may say clinical social worker, other times I'll say psychoanalyst. It really does depend. But I'm always a clinical social worker in my heart, in my being, how I relate, the matter that we said earlier, that Barb was saying, the person and the environment. We do bring unique features, both a value foundation and who we are and how we are in the world.
So, Bill, if someone asks you who you are, what do you say?
I always say I'm a clinical social worker.
Okay.
And
I mean it.
And, I was thinking back to how I got involved in this. And when I was in social work school, I thought many of the courses were interesting, but they didn't really speak to me. And then I had one teacher who taught a course in ego psychology. And suddenly it opened up kind of a world to me, and he was singing my song. And then I worked on inpatient psychiatry at the University of Chicago, and I started working with several psychoanalysts, and they were singing my song. And then when I left Chicago and I moved to North Carolina, part of the reason that I moved there was because they had a very vibrant psychoanalytic community to begin with. And I got involved with different people. I got involved in a study group, supervision, my own analysis, and so forth. And I could see that this really represented a way of understanding people in a manner of depth, and a way of putting things together that nothing else compared to. And to be part of that and part of clinical social work, it really did feel like this was my big family.
I know myself, when I was young, when I started with this organization, it's done so much for my identity because I would call myself a therapist or an analyst, but not a clinical social work analyst or clinical social work therapist, which is how I refer to myself now. And I think it's very important. It took me years to get comfortable with that because, as I said, I was trained. The clinical was not allowed. The word clinical was not allowed, or psychiatric was not allowed to be used. And you were actually punished for that with a lower grade.
We have passed licensing bills in every state which carry the title clinical social work somewhere on that level. So I think things are changing because now it's a legal title. At least in New York State, the schools have to declare a clinical social work track, which, believe me, killed them. They fought it in meeting after meeting with the State Board for Social Work. But it's the law.
we had students come to the board meeting. They were actually Bill's interns who were doing an internship in Durham in 2015, and we invited about 7 students to come to the board meeting so they could get a feeling of what an organization does, and especially an organization that's psychoanalytic. And they spoke to their issues of identity. What do they do after social work school? Do they go for a PhD in social work? Do they go to a psychoanalytic institute? In terms of their work, do they if they are interested or stimulated by psychodynamic ideas, psychoanalytic ideas, once they get into their placements, they really have a hard time practicing that. The sessions are shorter. It's controlled. Their placements are controlled by managed care. So they, just as recent as 2015, spoke to the same issues. I think that we're trying to illuminate here.
Unless we take really ownership that social work should be a kind of definition that can broaden, to me, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. That is in an addition, so to speak, or an inclusion of very, very, very valuable principles that are in the psychoanalytic mode of understanding.
I think that this is a very complicated matter, and I think you're all touching on pieces of this. I think that many of us realize at some point that maybe part of the reason we got into social work to begin with is that we had some deep identification with people who are marginalized. And I think that if we then encounter people in the public who, when we say clinical social work, they say, no, I would rather talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, or don't you work for the welfare department and so forth. Or we hear from professors that, social workers really have no business. It's elitist working, being a psychotherapist. I think we take these things in. And I think trying to evolve from that. And I like what you're saying, Simone, about growing into that part of it with recognition that what social work is about has to do partly with social justice, has to do partly with the building of relationships over time, and that this is something that isn't something to be ashamed of, but rather something that's really quite beautiful as part of the profession.
I hear two thoughts emerging. One is our marginalization that Creighton spoke about in terms of arriving at parity. And I think when you start off with feeling marginalized, it get carried on, even though things have improved. It may be part of our DNA still. And I think then going for analytic training, if that's the path we go to, or we get a PhD in clinical social work, it might change, but I think we carry that sense of marginalization.
Transgenerational transmission of shame.
Of shame, yeah. So maybe we carry the hatred, and it could be a lot more complicated than that in terms of our own personal histories. But then I want to say that, we want our own identity, which we do, but don't we also want an identity that is kind of universal?
The problem that if you sharply define your identity too much, then you create divisions, and heaven knows we're at a time in history right now where divisions are a problem. And I want to focus on something that I want to connect what you just said to what I've been listening to. I've not heard anyone define the AAPCSW or your contribution to it or your identity around a particular theory or technique. And I think that is impressive and remarkable, and I'll say why. Because it is there that you find the possibility for a shared work among the different professions. Because after all, what we have in common between psychologists and psychiatrists and others who would consider themselves psychotherapists is, in a sense, the question around what is a person.
I still see the main function of this organization is education, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic, and long-term therapy, because all of those concepts are under pressure and are being quietly eliminated on the fringes, definitely, and certainly in social work school.